Good evening. All right, welcome back to church again. On this, isn't it nice and cool in here? You know, the air conditioning has not been working in the loft. Something went haywire over there. So, by the way, Barb, I may work at home in the morning, just in air-conditioned comfort. So, isn't that good communication? Talking here in front of everybody. Okay, I'm going to pray, and then we're gonna roll tonight. Jesus, it's always good to meet with these people and to engage with them, to laugh with them, to hug them, shake hands with them, banter with them, and share, I think, important things about our lives together. And I pray that this evening will be productive as we talk through these important areas of talking and listening. And so, Lord, give us good attention tonight, I pray, in Jesus' name. Everybody said, Amen. You know, you guys are sounding more like Nazarenes all the time, kind of get into the whole thing. All right, we're going to start with kind of a review, and we'll kind of go quickly, but I'm going to try to fill in the blanks, all right, so that you can get those. And those of you who maybe this is your first time, you came on a good night because we are going to review the sessions that we've done before, but I'll try to whip through just so you'll get the fill-ins along the way. But we started this whole thing talking about the 4 G's of peacemaking, the 4 G's of peacemaking, and some of you may even be able to put those in for yourself, but I'm not going to give you time to feed back to me. We're going to say, first of all, to glorify God. First G of peacemaking is we want to glorify God. How can I honor and glorify God in this situation, specifically in this conflict situation? Secondly, get the log out of your eye. Get the log. That's the second G. Get the log out of your eye. How can I show Jesus' work in me? By taking responsibility for my contribution to the conflict. That is probably the biggest challenge that we face when we're going into this kind of a conversation, is to focus on ourselves first and say, what do I need to deal with in my own life? Third G is gently restore. Gently restore. How can I lovingly serve others? By helping them take responsibility for their contribution to the conflict. So when we're looking at these things and we realize that someone else has gotten out of step, I need to do that in a gentle way. And then finally, go and be reconciled. I'm from the Northwest. Really close to us is Nike, and you all know what this means. What? Just do it. We actually go. So it isn't just something we put in the brain and say, I know the right answers. Just do it. Go and be reconciled. 3 major responses to conflict. And I think first week we had some good conversation around the tables about maybe the kind of conflict that the way your family usually dealt with conflict. Some majored in escape responses. Escape responses. That's seeking to avoid rather than resolve conflict. And that was certainly true in the family that I grew up in. Escape responses include things like denial. We just kind of look the other way, pretend that there's nothing exists, that there is no conflict at all. Or flight. We just get out of there as quickly as we possibly can, and so that may mean running away, leaving the house, ending a friendship, quit your job, file for divorce, change churches. You just get out of there. It's flight. And then the ultimate flight or escape response, of course, is suicide. Suicide, where people don't see any hope of reconciliation. And as we mentioned before, even the threat, if somebody brings up or you think there's a possibility of somebody doing damage to themselves, a lot of times that ends conversation, doesn't it? Because we don't want to be responsible for somebody actually taking their life. So that's the threat of suicide in itself is an escape response. Then there are attack responses. Some of you were raised in more aggressive environments, perhaps. And first one of those is assault. That is force or intimidation. That includes things like threats and gossip and slander, physical violence, damaging someone financially or professionally. So it's actual assault. And then a second attack response is litigation. I'll see you in court. And as we've talked about before, this usually, it really doesn't even matter how the lawsuit comes out. The relationship is usually destroyed just by the very act of going to court. And so that's litigation. And then the ultimate attack response is murder. In God's eyes, of course, even harbored anger and contempt constitute murder. But some have gone so far, and I understand there's even a case in in Bethel's history where there was a murder that took place. And I don't know all of the details of that, but you understand how extreme it can go. So you've got escape responses, you have attack responses, and then, of course, what we've been talking about is peacemaking responses. That's seeking to find just and mutually agreeable solutions to conflict. The first way to do that is to overlook an offense. It's the glory of man to overlook an offense. It's a form of forgiveness where we simply decide, you know what, that's just not that big a deal. I can let that one go. I can let that one slide. But along with that is a decision that we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to dwell on it. We're not going to let it grow into bitterness. So we're not talking about stuffing it. That's a different type of a thing. Letting go is different than stuffing it. Because when we stuff it, eventually it's probably going to come out, isn't it? But when we are talking about overlooking it, that's a different type of a thing completely. Reconciliation, of course. It's too serious to overlook. It's damaged a relationship, and so that can involve confession, loving correction, and forgiveness. And so I'm intent now of going in and saying, what can we do? How can I reconcile with this person? A third kind of peacemaking, and that is negotiation. Negotiation, and that's cooperative bargaining. It's a process to reach a settlement which satisfies the legitimate needs on both sides. So what can we negotiate about this and come to some kind of a conclusion, some kind of resolution? And then one more is mediation. Mediation, that's where you bring in that objective third party to help communicate and explore possible solutions. And I've mentioned that I've been involved in a few of those. Arbitration is number 5. That's where you appoint one or more people to listen, investigate, and then render a binding decision. Now, that's the difference. With mediation, you're just there, and I'm trying to help these people communicate with each other, okay, to talk and to listen. Did you hear what they just said? Can you kind of reflect back to me what you just heard? That kind of a thing. Arbitration is where you, and I think I actually gave an example of this from a situation that took place in our church, but someone is appointed to actually make a decision. And so they hear both parties, they hear both concerns, both sides, and then with that they say they are going to render now this decision. And that takes an agreement going into it that you're going to abide by that decision, okay? Whatever that decision is, you're going to follow it. And so that's the only way that will work. And then the last one, I put down the word accountability, but really a better word, number 6, is discipline. That's discipline. That's when church leaders intervene to hold people accountable to Scripture, to promote repentance, justice, and forgiveness. And we're going to talk more about the church discipline process next week. Session 2 was preparation. Pastor Jim led you in that study. And the first thing you do in preparation, I think about peace talks. And if you were going into an international peace talk, you wouldn't just go to shoot from the hip, would you? You'd have to do some planning, some thinking about this before you get into that situation. So this is the importance of preparation. We've got some lawyers here. James, I'm sure that's true with you. You go into a court case and you've got to be well prepared with the information, the things that you're going to say. So we define the issues. First of all, we define the issues. They may be material issues. It could be property, money, rights and responsibilities, contract disputes, hiring and firing. They may be resolved through negotiation, but you're defining what are the issues. So material, sometimes they're material, tangible things where money is involved or property is involved. Other times it's personal issues, and this is probably what we deal with mostly. And we're talking about attitudes and feelings and words and gossip and slander and reactions and the treatment of others. And those kinds of things are resolved through confession, loving correction, and forgiveness. So first of all, you've got to start by defining what are we talking about to begin with. And I can't strongly enough encourage you when you get something out. Charles Swindoll used to quote this little poem, and I don't know who wrote it, but he said, thoughts disentangle themselves when they cross over the lips and through the fingertips. Isn't that good? Thoughts disentangle themselves when they cross over the lips, and through the fingertips. And so you've got all of these things that are rolling around in your head. You're thinking about them, you're tossing and turning, you're always going over them and over them. But what helps to define them is to try to verbalize them. So if we can say them, if we can put them out that way, and even get to that next point of actually writing down what the issues are, it helps so much when we're going into this. It's part of preparation. So define the issues. Something we've already talked about with preparation, and that is overlook minor offenses. Overlook minor offenses. Not stuffing it, it's not denial, it's not filing it away for later use against somebody. It's deciding, making a decision that we're not going to talk about it, dwell on it, or let it grow into pent-up bitterness. So overlook. Third part of preparation, 2 words here, check and change your attitude. Check and change your attitude. Paul talked about this, giving instructions in terms of the conflict between these 2 women, Euodia and Syntyche. And in the context of Philippians 2, which I preached, we studied it in our Rejoice Regardless series. All of it was done in the context of rejoice regardless, wasn't it? Rejoice in the Lord always. And so we need to deal with our own attitudes first, regardless of, even before we get to the issues, we've got to deal with some stuff. We can't use the situation as an excuse for ungodly attitudes or ungodly responses to people. So we've got to deal with our own attitude. We've got to prepare our own heart and attitude. And of course, that's something that Satan does not want us to do. He wants us to go into these conversations loaded for bear. He wants us to go in as upset as we possibly can be, so that we're just going to spew some words and we're going to do some things that completely disrail the possibility of reconciliation. So it kind of is the same thing as taking the log out of the eye, but here we're preparing. We need to check and change the attitude to get to that place of gentleness. Let your gentleness be evident to all. It's the opposite of being irritable, rude, or abrasive. Along with checking and changing your attitude, Ken Sande mentioned something called the golden result. I like that. The golden result. And it means that it's kind of an iteration of the golden rule, but it's by treating people with gentleness, it may result in their responding in kind. In other words, if we're exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit as we're approaching someone, there's a better possibility that they're going to respond to us in kind. Number 4, under preparation, see things as they really are. See things as they really are. That is gaining a more accurate, balanced view, specifically, not just of the situation, but a more balanced view of the other person. And we have this passage in Philippians 3. It says, whatever is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellence and praiseworthy, think about these things. So in going in, part of the discipline is getting a balanced picture of this other person. What are some things that you know about them that are true and noble and right? And you say, I can't think of anything about them. That could be good. They don't deserve to live. You can almost get that, upset about something. But it's taking that time now to say, I want a balanced view here. I need to see this person more accurately. And chances are they are not the devil incarnate, right? Chances are they're not. Chances are they've got issues in their life, but there's also some redeeming qualities in them, and I need to be willing to focus on those so that I'm going in a more balanced kind of way. So we recall positive traits and experiences which help you realize how much will be lost if this conflict is not resolved. Third session, we talked about confession. We talked about 7 A's of confession. So we're going to quickly fill in those blanks. For some of you, you'll be doing this again. For some of you, for the first time. And for some of you, all of you, you'll find this is the answer book, folks. It's all the stuff is in here. I have used this completely in our whole process. So 7 A's of confession. What does confession mean? First of all, address everyone involved. Address everyone involved. And the general rule of thumb is that the circles of offense should be the circles of confession. And so if you offended or you got into a conflict with a person one-on-one, then I need to go to you one-on-one and have us have the conversation. If that happened around a table here, or it happened within earshot of other people, then I need to make my confession as broad as the offense has been. So address everyone involved. That's true confession. Then avoid. Second A is avoid. And you know the words to avoid. If, but, and maybe. Avoid. If, but, and maybe. That is blame shifting. It's minimizing. It's excusing. Anytime I'm saying anything and I use that word but or if, I'm usually just canceling out everything that I've said before. Now I'm going to tell you what I really think. I said this stuff to kind of be nice, but now I'm going to tell you what I really think. But we avoid those words. And Tony Evans said it this way: if it contains an if, it ain't a confession. If it contains an if, it ain't a confession. So avoid if, but, and maybe. Third A is admit specifically. Admit specifically. Name the action or the lack thereof. This could be attitudes. It could be things like naming it and calling it things like selfishness, ingratitude. I was envious. I am bitter. I was jealous. I was resentful. I was disloyal. I was stubborn. I was insensitive. A true confession is specific. We need to say what, and again, if we kind of go back and compare that last thing, that sweet thing that people use, if I have offended you, I am sorry. Which says, in essence, if I offended you, and I probably did because you're so cotton-picking insensitive anyway, but if if in your weakness I have offended you, I'm sorry. That just goes a long way to bringing people together, doesn't it? Doesn't work. We need to be really specific without the if, but, or and. Number 4, the fourth A is acknowledge. Acknowledge the hurt. It isn't just what I do or what I say, but it's acknowledging how this affected you. It's admitting how this affected you. Number 5, accept the consequences. This is the prodigal son, isn't it? Accept the consequences. So when I'm confessing, a lot of times we say, all I should have to do is, if I go through this, then I'm immediately absolved of all consequences. There's no follow-up needed on my part because I have admitted to you that I did something wrong. But that is not always the case. If I confess honestly that I stole from you $100, oh, it's nice that I confess that to you, isn't it? But now I need to follow up and do what? Pay you back, that's right. Matter of fact, it might not be a bad idea to pay you back with a little interest too, at least to offer. It may mean, if we're on the job, it may mean accepting the demotion or even the loss of the job, the loss of fellowship, the loss of trust. And again, this is the prodigal son, where he goes back and he said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to even be called your son. And so just, what did he say? Make me like one of the hired guys. Even though I'm your son, you treat me like just an employee. And I'm willing for that. When somebody says something like that and willing to accept the consequences, then you know they have truly accepted. They're being honest about the confession. Number 6 is alter your behavior. Alter your behavior. It's developing some kind of a plan of action, and in some cases, again, if this is honest confession, we're honestly confessing to somebody, then we're saying, I want to do better in the future. I want to do differently in the future. And you may even have that conversation, can you help me with that? What are some ways that you think I could do better in the future? And then the final A of confession is ask for forgiveness and allow time. You can't demand forgiveness. You can't demand it. A lot of times we try to do that. We've dealt with some discipline situations in our church in Portland, And it's almost like people are done there. Okay, I walked through the steps now. You got to forgive us. Because the Bible says you have to forgive us. Well, the person who's truly confessing sin is in no position to demand anything. In the same way that we can go to God and we're being honest with him, and then we say to him, God, you've got to forgive me. No, he doesn't. He chooses to. He chooses to. But forgiveness isn't something that we demand. Especially, we can't demand it on the spot. So we ask forgiveness, but we also allow time for them to process through. Fourth session, we talked about that word carefrontation. Carefrontation. And we talked about 4 reasons for loving confrontation of a fellow believer. We said the first one is that their actions are dishonoring God. We need to have that hard conversation because what they're doing is dishonoring to God. What they're doing is causing others to think less of God, his church, or his word. It could include bashing and slander, spreading stories, whatever the situation is. But by the very act of doing that, they are dishonoring God, the one that they claim to love and serve. Another reason for a carefrontation is their actions or attitudes are damaging your relationship. They're damaging your relationship between the two of you. Your feelings, thoughts, words, or actions toward another person have been altered for more than a short period of time. You just can't get over it. You've tried to do the thing of I'm just going to let it go, but you can't. And so at that point you say, we really need to have this conversation because this relationship is important. This relationship is important enough for me to take this step, to go into this difficult conversation. A third reason for a carefrontation is that their behavior is hurting other people. Their behavior is hurting others, causing others to be led astray by following a very negative example. And then finally, they are hurting themselves. If they're hurting, clearly they're hurting themselves, and that's a reason for a carefrontation. When you consider engaging, let's talk about when to consider engaging a mediator, a third person in this whole process. First of all, when either of the parties feels intimidated by the other. When either of the two parties feels intimidated by the other. And that may be due to a difference in their verbal skills, their position of authority, or their influence. And so going into this difficult conversation and you just feel like you're unevenly matched. And it's unlikely that you're going to have a real good conversation. So at that point, you're saying we really need help to help us to engage in this conversation. Also, another reason to engage a mediator is when abuse has been involved and the abuser might use the personal conversation to manipulate or silence the victim. And I'm sure you can understand this. If somebody has been physically abused, for them to go to the person who did that to them, that can put them in a very difficult situation. So that's where another situation where the mediator would be used at that point, so that there's some protection for the people going into the conversation. If a Christian is at fault, of course, I think the church has a responsibility to investigate, to confront sin, to promote repentance, and even support counseling, to say, we'll get behind you, we'll do whatever we can to help you get right with God in this situation. And this may require things like submission to civil authorities, accepting legal consequences. We talked about that last week. We talked about the whole immigration situation, which is a real hot topic right now. And usually what I do is I point people to the book of Philemon, because Philemon is a great example of an immigration situation from the standpoint that Onesimus ran away from his master, who was Philemon. And he became a Christian under Paul's ministry. He began to serve Paul, and Paul sent him back. He sent him back to Philemon and saying, you've got to get things right with Philemon. And then he said to Philemon, you can choose to keep him, or you can choose to send him back to me. I'm telling you that I will offer to pay his debts, whatever they may be. But nevertheless, Onesimus had to be willing at that point to take the consequences of his action, because he had run away from his master. And so a mediator was needed, and in that situation, Paul was the mediator. And then, of course, another reason why you would engage a mediator, and that's when communication and trust is broken to the point where they really can't hear each other. And that can happen, as you know. Sometimes that happens in a marriage where they've heard the same things over and over and over again when trust has been broken. And so now they're not even hearing each other anymore, regardless of the talk. And so that's where a mediator can come in and help them communicate with each other. All right, that was a flying leap over the weeks that we've had. Now we're going to move into this presentation on communication. And we're going to start. The best part of communication, and the most important part, is listening. I need somebody to read real strong James 1:19. James 1:19. Now, I'm not a dancer, but there's a rhythm in that. Quick, slow, slow. Quick, slow, slow. I'm not exactly sure what kind of dance that is. Can anybody tell me? What is it? A two-step, all right. That's what we're looking at here, is we're looking at a two-step, right? Everybody be quick to what? Hear. And slow to get angered. That's right. So you just got to get your rhythm down, folks. Get into the Texas two-step, and that will help you a lot. So we start with the whole thing of listening. And the first fill in there is we improve our listening skills. You're going to love this, by waiting. By waiting. And that means being patient while other people talk. Boy, that's hard. Somebody look up and read Proverbs 15:28. It's good enough for everybody to hear. Proverbs 15:28. Thank you. Ooh, those are great word pictures. Aren't they good word pictures along that way? Be patient while others talk. Do you ever find yourself getting so impatient you want to just say, get up, because I got things I want to say to you. You know, I got responses that I've been working on, and I don't know if I can hang in here and listen to everything that you've got to say. Resist jumping into premature conclusions. Hear them out. We had a dear lady at one of our churches that had a major stuttering problem. And if you've ever been around a stutterer, you know that the biggest temptation is to do what? Right. Finish their sentence, finish their word for them. What you're trying to get with it, get with it, get with it. And one of the things I was so impressed with at the people in that church was how patient they were to listen to her. Now, she was great. We had great communication email-wise because she typed just fine and she thought just fine, but for some reason she dealt with this stuttering situation. But this is a discipline to hear them out, not to jump to premature conclusions. Discipline yourself not to interrupt. This is hard for us too, and that is being comfortable with silence rather than pouncing on a pause. You know what I'm talking about, folks? They take a breath, oh, and you're right there. Again, this shows great respect for the other person when we start with listening. Don't offer immediate solutions, but allow time to kind of talk through this. So we start by waiting. Second fill-in is by paying attention. By paying attention. I drive up and down Phillip every day. And you know the Assembly of God Church there's got those great sayings on the sign. Now, I've been by a lot of churches that had those, and I thought they were really corny. But they always have good ones there. I got to meet the pastor someday. I don't know if he comes up with these or what service he uses, but this one was good enough to remember. It said, great leaders pay attention, bad leaders seek attention. Isn't that good? Great leaders pay attention. Bad leaders seek attention. Pay attention. The human mind can think 4 times faster than a person can talk. Ooh, how about that? Now, some of you are doubting that as we get older. Sometimes we doubt that is the case, but it's really true. We can think 4 times faster than a person can talk. While waiting for someone to get to the point, again, the temptation is that we're forming our response. And when we do this, of course, it discourages communication. It shows disrespect for the one who is talking. How do we show that we're paying attention? How do we engage in a way that we are truly paying attention? Here's some real practical suggestions. Eye contact. Regular eye contact. Avoiding negative body language. If we're doing this, that body language is not encouraging good communication, obviously. The tapping foot, gazing around the room, all those kinds of things. So it's that discipline of paying attention so that we really are trying to focus in, because I want to know what they think. I really want to know what they have to say, rather than having them say about a sentence and then saying, oh, I know where this is going. I know exactly where this is going. Now, this is obvious too. We need to eliminate distractions. Every cotton picking week, Lois says to me, have you turned your phone off yet? Have you turned your phone off yet? And so I try to remember, yep, is it still off? I think it is. I was leading a Good Friday service one time in Hood River, Oregon, and my phone went off. And it was right after I'd asked everybody to turn theirs off. Whatever we can do. Obviously, it's pretty hard to have this conversation if the television is going on or if the phone's about to ring. Whatever it takes to show that we really are focused. And that can include things like leaning forward, working on our facial expressions, nodding our head, responding verbally, doing whatever it takes to let people know that we really want to know what they have to say. One of the compliments that I have received about my wife, and there have been a lot of them, usually more than I get, to tell you the truth, but nevertheless, is that when Lois has been in a Sunday school class or in a small group, they say, we love having Lois in our group because she's always doing this. She's engaged, and nothing is better. I don't know if you see that in a small group. Nothing gets people going more and encouraged more than to know people really are engaged with what they're saying. So that's a great trait, to be a good listener. We would go home. I had this little joke, and I can't remember if I've told this before. It's because I'm old. But anyway, we were interviewing with this church, and it was kind of austere. And the board, I met with a general board. They had all kinds of boards. I met with the general board, very austere. And so anyway, they were quizzing me about different things like that. And so finally they got around to my wife, and they said, now just exactly, how has your wife been involved in ministry? It's kind of that kind of tone, how's she been involved in ministry? And I said, she's a bartender. And it got real quiet, and the chairman said, Pastor, could you explain that a little bit more? And I said, yeah, Lois has worked at the coffee bar at our church for the last several years. And I said, she hears stuff. She says, you put a cup of coffee in somebody's hand, and they just kind of share stuff. And so she always had inside information on people. And so sometimes she'd say, how's so-and-so doing? I said, oh, they're doing great. She said, no, they're not. I said, they're not? She said, no. I talked to the wife today. She told me what was really going on. That ability to listen is so important. So if you want to be a good listener, take a job as a bartender. I guess that's the principle here. I'm not sure. Another way that we do this is by asking clarifying questions. Asking clarifying questions, not accusatory gotcha questions, but clarifying questions. And that includes phrases like this: could you tell me more about that? Could you share an example of that with me so I fully understand what you're saying? I'm confused about this part that you mentioned. Let me see if I understand. Those are things that are inviting more conversation from that other person. So I'm asking clarifying questions because I really do want to listen. I want to know what's not simply coming out of their mouth, but what's on their mind. Another way that we do this is by reflecting. Reflecting. That's another word for paraphrasing or summarizing the main points of your own words. There's some good examples of that on pages 167 and 168. And you'll look at that on the bottom of 167 and the top of 168. So I'd like someone to stand up and read those real loud and clear so everybody can understand. But turn to 167 and 168, and these are good examples of reflecting back so that we're trying to understand. So somebody like to do that. So we're clarifying what they're saying, and we're saying it in these words that let them know that we heard them. Letting them know that we heard what they said. And then if we got it wrong, they can say, no, that's not what I meant to say. So again, you're encouraging that conversation. That's all part of reflecting back. Now, this isn't agreement. This doesn't require agreement with what they're saying, only that you understand what they're saying, okay? And there's a lot of times when we're dealing with conflict situations that we may never come to full agreement about an issue, but we at least can come to understanding of that other person's point of view. They're less likely to repeat themselves or to raise their voice to get the point across if, in fact, we are indicating to them, I got it. I understand what you're saying to me. By doing the reflecting part, it also narrows the focus to a specific topic rather than dealing with a whole lot of things at the same time. So we're zeroing in on the main thing, the main topic of conversation or topic of conflict. It also, by doing that, it slows the pace of the conversation when emotions are high and the words are spoken in haste. And so at that point, we want to slow the conversation down because we're not trying to get over this, all right? We're not just trying to get through this. We're trying to build understanding. We're trying to truly reconcile with this person. Now, the fact is that others, it may take more time to actually do this. And so it may take more than one meeting to really get to the essence of that whole thing. But we're reflecting back. And when we do that, when we let people know that we really are understanding and working to understand their perspective, there's a possibility that they're going to be more willing to hear than what we have to say, all right? Remember the golden result? We're modeling something from that standpoint, and there's a possibility that they may respond in kind. Another important part of listening is agreeing. By agreeing, that is acknowledging what is true before addressing areas of disagreement. When we hear something that we say, all right, we want to find some common ground here. So we hear something that we agree with them about. We resist the temptation to defend ourselves, to blame other people, to justify our action, or to skip back into areas of disagreement. We want to try to tie into the things that we really do agree about, to find the truth from our perspective about what they are saying, what that other person is saying to us. Sometimes we're reluctant to admit wrong on one issue because we're afraid if we admit, yeah, I see what you're saying here, and you know what? I agree with that. I agree with that about that situation, or I agree with you about my actions, my response. I can understand why you thought what you thought, or why you felt what you felt. We're on the same page there. I get it. We're finding that common ground. Sometimes the fear is that if we do that on one issue, we agree on one issue, that we're instantly claiming full responsibility for everything else that they may bring up at that point. But that's why we need to focus in on one thing at a time, isn't it, rather than trying to deal with the whole Megillah. So at that point, we're just saying, I get that, and I think we can agree with that. Look at page 169 in your book. 169. And some of these things, again, written out. Middle of the page, we've got this quote. Now that I've heard you, I can see that part of this problem really is my fault. I was wrong not to fulfill my part of the agreement. And then I made things even worse when I complained about you to others. What else do you believe that I did wrong? Would you say that person would think you're engaging at that point? You're trying to find those places where we can agree. I agree that I was wrong not to follow through on my commitment, and I need to be more faithful in the future. I believe there's more to this problem than just that, but before we talk about what you've done wrong, I want to hear you out. Would you please be more specific about how my actions hurt you? Again, these are things that open conversation, aren't they? They open healthy discussion rather than closing it off. These kinds of responses obviously require humility and emotional control. And a controlled response does a lot more for peace than an emotional reaction. If you've ever been in that situation where you've lost it, or the person talking to you has lost it, boy, I tell you, it's hard to recover from that. It's hard to get back. Again, there usually has to be, then you have to deal with the offenses related to the reaction, right? Before you can even get back to the presenting problem or the presenting issue, you have to deal with the reaction that made this situation worse than it was. So those are a few things on listening skills. So let's talk about speaking skills. I like the way Ken Sande uses this word, but he says, breathe grace. Breathe grace. When we speak, we want to breathe grace. It's based on an authentic relationship with God. When we breathe grace, it indicates that we're filled with the Spirit and that fruit is being produced in us and through us from Galatians 5:22 and 23. I think and I agree with Ken Sande in this, that when one person in a conflict does this, others it's more likely that they're going to respond in kind, that they're going to be less defensive and more inclined to listen to our concerns. One of the things that I've talked about when I have done some marriage counseling, and I've said before, not my strong suit, so I don't do a lot of it, but when I've done it before, one of the questions I've asked is, how does a man or woman of God respond to this difficult situation? How does a man or woman of God respond in a difficult marriage when it's not what you would want it to be? How does a man or woman of God respond to that? Does that give me license then to react and to sin in a whole bunch of other ways? How does a man or woman of God respond to this kind of a situation? Make charitable judgments. Make charitable judgments. Attitudes and expressions usually carry a lot of weight, even more than words. And if people sense that we have jumped to conclusions or that we are actually enjoying finding faults, like we're on a fault hunt, we're going to look for sins, and as soon as we find them, as soon as they reveal them, man, we're going to be all over them. If they sense that that's our attitude, it's going to be really hard to have much of a conversation and come closer to reconciliation. If they sense that we're trying to believe the best about them, and the questions that we're asking are designed so that we can believe the best about them, they're going to be more inclined to listen. Strive to believe the best until the facts prove otherwise. Now, if you can listen to another person and realize that there's a couple different ways, at least a couple different ways to interpret what someone has said to you, you can make a choice to believe the best first. The best possible scenario about them, to embrace that over the negative. That's where you go first. It's believing the best. And that's one of the things that we learned, by the way, in 1 Corinthians 13, right? Love believes the best. It rejoices with the truth, and it believes the best. And so that's where we start. We start by believing the best. Or at least we postpone judgment until we get more information, until we get more insight. James chapter 4 talks about the dangers of judgment. And of course, Jesus did the same thing in the Sermon on the Mount. Communication usually improves when we give the benefit of the doubt. And when we put things in the best possible light, when we try to think of good reasons why they may have done what they did or said what they said. It doesn't do any good. We don't win anything by backing people into the corner. Some people are better than this than others. I can imagine that'd be hard for some of you lawyers out there to do that because, you kind of, you're kind of trained to do that, aren't you, James? I don't know for sure. But, yeah, you're going to prove your case. And when we go into a conflict situation, a personal conflict situation especially, and we're trying to prove the case by disproving them, and we're going to back them into that corner and prove that we're right and they're wrong, that rarely results in reconciliation. It just exacerbates the conflict. Make charitable judgments. I got hooked on Facebook this afternoon, and they run a bunch of videos. I'd never even seen the videos on Facebook before, and it had one of a judge back in Boston someplace making a charitable judgment against a guy who had clearly had a traffic violation. And he did this because the guy was a Vietnam vet, and he felt really badly about Vietnam vets. And the guy had just come from a visit to a VA hospital, and he was upset. And so that was kind of the story that he told. Now, the judge would have had every right to level the fine because he obviously did the crime, right? But he made a charitable judgment. It was an amazing story. Speak the truth in love. Speak the truth in love. Even to people who have wronged or mistreated you. Somebody read 1 Peter 3, verses 8 and 9. 1 Peter 3, verses 8 and 9. Boy, there's a lot of wonderful truth in those two verses. But that's all part of this breathing grace. We're speaking the truth, and even speaking hard truth, but doing it with an attitude of love. Speaking with gentleness and patience and concern for their well-being and even their interests. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4 talks about the same things, where we're going into this conversation, and I'm not just concerned about my interests or my perspective, but I really want to understand the interests and perspective of that other person. Sometimes it's necessary to speak in firm or blunt language if they refuse to pay attention, especially if we're talking about a discipline type of a situation. But the gentle approach should always be the first approach. Should always be the first approach. But stronger words are more likely to evoke defensiveness and antagonism. So when we come out of the gate like we're riding the bull, they're going to respond in kind. The defensiveness is going to fly up there. And I think when we lose that, it's really difficult to return to a friendly, casual atmosphere after those kinds of tones have been used. As we said before, here's another section I think it's good to read. 1 Thessalonians 5, 14 and 15. That's, again, that a lot of sweet, practical truth in those verses. Number 4, choose the right time and place. Choose the right time and place. Avoid discussing sensitive matters when someone is tired, worried, or generally in a bad mood. Make sure there's time to discuss it thoroughly. You don't discuss sensitive things in front of a lot of people. We want to be in a place that's relatively free of distraction. May I suggest that pulling somebody over into a corner of the auditorium between services may not be the best time to have that difficult conversation, where we kind of quickly, I just got a few minutes, I want to dump this load on you. Boom, like that, okay? We're trying to be sensitive. Where can we really have the most effective kind of conversation? So that's choosing the time and a place where they're going to feel relatively safe. That may be in their own home. It may be at Scooters or Starbucks. It just really depends on the person. So choose the right time and place. Talk in person whenever possible. Talk in person whenever possible. That's a lot better than telephones. It's a lot better than emails, texts, or letters, because when we send those things, they cannot see the facial expressions. They can't see the body language. And it just makes it more stilted. And so we try to make an appointment rather than dropping by impromptu. Hey, got a few minutes? There's a few things I'd like to dump on you. That usually doesn't go over too good. But we're trying to say, there's a conversation that I need to have, and so can we make an appointment? And we want to deal with it as soon as we can. I talked a little about the letters thing last week. There are so many dangers with letters, and I realize that sometimes we think that's the only thing that we can do, especially if we can't get together with them in an appointment. If you got to write something, make it brief and personal and gracious. Brief and personal and gracious. One of the things, and I've seen this so much coming from Christians, is that they take this letter and they go to their thesaurus, I think, or they go to their concordance, and they flood it with Bible references. And of course, all of the Bible references that are usually used like this. Ching, 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 got you there. All right, that's the way I'm using the Bible. I'm really shooting these things down. And we overload it, or we get real preachy in those things. And again, the whole point of this is reconciliation, isn't it? It's not so that I can be proven right. The whole point is reconciliation. So we need to be brief, personal, and gracious. Avoid numerous Bible references or preaching. Don't try to justify your conduct, because it usually will be misunderstood. Usually the best way for, if we have to do anything written at that point, is to use the written thing to make an appointment so that we can get together and talk about this more fully. I really want to have this conversation with you. And so we're going to follow up from the letter, in other words. This whole thing, these things are rarely solved. I don't think instant message was designed to work through big issues. I really don't. But a lot of times we try to do it through texting. And we try to have this conversation going. And sometimes there seem to be practical reasons for doing that. But for the most part, they just don't achieve what we really want them to achieve, because they come across as very impersonal. If you're going to write something, usually a good thing is to write it, set it aside for a while, reread it, to try to guard against trigger words. But my experience with things that I have written, as well as things that I have received, is that people tend to exegete the written text like they exegete the Bible. And they go to that. Why did she use that word? That word. Exactly why. She could have said that so much differently than she said it. And that really, she's really betraying her true feelings or her true attitudes about this thing. That's what happens with letters for the most part. Whereas when you can sit down face to face with someone, the facial expressions, the concern that's there, the openness there, if there is going to be reconciliation, it's usually going to be in that kind of a situation. But if something has to be written, I think it has to drip with grace. I'm not saying drip with flattery. I'm not saying drip with saccharin, but dripping with grace. Talk in person whenever possible. Number 7, plan your words. Plan your words. Communicate. This is the goal, is to communicate so clearly that you cannot be misunderstood. Of course, one of the Murphy's laws is, if it can be misunderstood, what? It will be misunderstood, right? So if there's any possibility, so the goal is, I want to go overboard in trying to be as clear as I possibly can. And then to change or to avoid words that may be vague, imprecise, potentially misleading. We talked about the dangers of writing. I'm not suggesting that we write a script and read the script to them either. That comes across as fairly impersonal as well. If anything, when we write things out, it's to clarify it in our own minds. Remember, thoughts disentangle themselves when they cross over the lips and through the fingertips. So sometimes we're going into this difficult conversation and we're writing some things down just to bring clarity to our own mind. You don't want to continue the argument. You want a positive dialogue. If there's an angry reaction, then we go to Proverbs 51, which says, a soft answer turns away wrath. The gentle voice, the relaxed tone, the calm gestures. Now, what I've also learned by experience is that while we're trying to do all of that, we don't, again, put something back on them when we say things. You just need to take a chill pill. Calm down. Get yourself under control so we can have a reasonable conversation. That goes really well, doesn't it? Wives I found really respond to that kind of thing very, very well. Maybe that's why Lois is in Portland. I don't know. But anyway. But we do need to have that soft answer, not the sarcastic answer, but the soft answer in the gentle voice. If they're angry, we need to take their anger seriously. And say, don't be mad. That doesn't help either, doesn't it? Don't be mad. Just stop being mad. Doesn't work. We take it seriously. You're really upset, aren't you? Maybe there's a better time for us to have this conversation. Because what we want to work for here is resolution. Number 8. This may seem to be a contradiction to some of the other things we've said, but use I statements. It gives information about myself rather than attacking the other person. You are so insensitive. You're so irresponsible. Page 179 in your book. And again, this is kind of, we're wanting to speak now and we're trying to communicate at that level. And so here, again, these aren't things to write out and read to them or write out and send to them, but to write out and get our own thinking straight. I feel hurt when you make fun of me in front of other people because it makes me feel stupid and foolish. As a result, I'm getting reluctant to go places with you when others may be around. I feel frustrated when you fail to keep your commitments because you play a key role in this department. As a result, I'm finding it difficult to depend on you or work with you. I feel confused when you say that I never listened because 2 days ago I sat here for over an hour while you shared several deep concerns with me. I really don't know what to do differently. So we're trying to communicate to them how these things are affecting us rather than putting the blame on them. Use the I statements well. How that person's conduct is affecting you. Be objective, number 9, and specific. Be objective and specific. Avoid exaggerations. And, of course, these are classic, aren't they? You always. You never. Every time you do this. Those kind of generalizations don't help. And then, as we've mentioned before, use the Bible carefully. We don't quote God's word to tear other people down. We quote it to build them up. It's important that if we're going to use the Bible, we also use it for its intended purpose. And a lot of times what we do is we take things out of context, don't we? We're trying to make a point, and so it has nothing to do with the rest of what that section of Scripture is talking about. But we just take the words themselves and use them in a pointed way. So use the Bible carefully. And know when to stop and give them time to process. Ask for feedback. This is hard too. And that's where we ask for questions. When we've listened, and now we're at the place where we're now sharing from our hearts, our perspective. And we've had an opportunity to share some of that, and we use phrases like, "What did you hear me say? Have I explained myself clearly enough? What have I said that you agree with? Is there anything I said that you agree with? What do you disagree with?" By the way, this is, again, often the role when we can't do this one-on-one. That's the role that a mediator plays. And we use phrases like that. What did you just hear her say? What came through? I was having a little problem with a worship pastor. Can you believe, John, that anybody would have a problem with a worship leader or worship pastor? Well, very unique situation anyway. And we just were not connecting very well at all. So I actually asked another of our staff members if he would mediate a conversation between us, which he did. And he did a really good job of it. He employed a lot of these things. But he brought out something really good, and where I thought I was making a suggestion to the worship pastor. John, maybe you can relate to this, I don't know. And he was taking offense to it. And so when I would say things like, do you think we could have maybe one less song in the worship service? And the associate pastor turned to the worship pastor and said, "What did you just hear Lynn say? That he doesn't like my worship ministry. That he thinks I'm doing a lousy job planning worship services." Lynn, do you think he does a lousy job in planning worship services? No, I think he's very gifted. He does a lot of things really well. I just think that sometimes we have maybe one too many songs in the service. Did you hear what he just said? That's the role of the mediator, isn't it? Now, sometimes we can do that one-on-one when we have that kind of conversation where we can kind of bring it out there and saying, if I disagree or I make a suggestion, I'm not saying you're doing a lousy job with everything in your life. I'm just making a suggestion for something that I think could help. It promotes dialogue and provides measurement on how well we're communicating with each other. Number 12, offer solutions and preferences. Offer solutions and preferences. We want to avoid the impression that we're coming into this and we've got all the answers and we've got all the solutions. We want to engage together in finding solutions here. And then recognize your limits. We can raise concerns, we can suggest solutions, we can encourage reasonable thinking, but we can't force anybody to change. Now, this is a hard thing to accept. We can't force anybody to change any more than they can force us to change. We're simply trying to create an atmosphere where hopefully, the Lord is free to do some changing in both of our lives and both of our hearts. I would like somebody to read 2 Timothy 2, 24 and 26. This is 24 through 26. This is a wonderful passage. I've gone back to it many times because I need to. 2 Timothy 2, 24 to 26. Okay, I like that phrase in there that says, God may grant them repentance. In other words, God working on their life, bringing them or bringing us to that place where we really are willing to acknowledge areas that we have done things wrong, where we have sinned or we've been thoughtless or whatever the situation is. So we need to recognize that there's some things that we can't do, and we have to trust the Holy Spirit to do that. Ultimately, we can't even force reconciliation, so these aren't magic rules. I think that these are things that will help us. I think these are principles that can help us with the conversation, and I think open the door, create a better atmosphere for the work that God wants to do in my life as well as in the life of that other person. Okay, I want us to spend a little time around the tables right now talking about these two questions. First is, which one of the listening skills, we went through a number of listening skills, do you think is most often neglected or more often neglected in a conflict? And then which of the speaking skills do you need to work on the most? So however you want to handle that. So kind of do a quick review in your mind, and then have a little conversation around the ones that you think are most often neglected or the ones that we need to work on the most. Listening and then speaking. You are free to stay and talk as long as you'd like. But I do want to kind of wrap things up officially here, and again, I appreciate